Now, the success has made China the world's second largest economy. That gets a lot of attention. It has displaced Japan to be the second largest economy, as if the importance of that is somehow self-evident and unlimited. Having the second largest economy must mean that China is destined to be part of a G2, is destined to challenge the American hegemonic position in the global system. That clashes between number one and number two are inevitable, and so on. That China has greater appeal. It must have more soft power because it has a bigger economy. Most of this is silly, in my judgment, and I'll try and illustrate that a little bit. One is China, part of it being the second largest economy, is that it's the world's largest trading nation. This is true. Statistically, it's mostly a function of where it is in the global production and supply chain. Things that used to go from Malaysia to Tokyo, or Indonesia or Vietnam to the EU or the United States, now go through China to get put in a box and have the Made in China sticker put on. The end destination is still Europe, Japan, and mostly the United States. It's just a stop. So it's a statistical artifact. But roughly 50%, actually slightly more than 50% of China's GDP is directly traceable to trade. That's twice the US GDP dependence on trade. We should trade more. That's a very different vulnerability. Vulnerability to the smooth functioning of the international system, to prosperity, to peace. China needs a peaceful international situation. Just on that dimension, it needs it twice as much as the United States. That's a silly way to think about it. But what I want to get across is being the big trading nation is not an unmitigated advantage. That many people, the perceptions point I was trying to make earlier, make more of this big economy than they should. Go back to China's rise was assisted by the OECD nations. The United States, the most developed, not opposed. And we have all the developed world has benefited enormously from China's participation in this global system. Many observers, unfortunately many of them academics, look at China's rise as somehow inevitably linked to the decline of others, specifically the decline of the United States, the number one power for a long time. It's kind of a seesaw version of international relations, international security. One goes up, the other one goes down, inevitable. Self-evident what the implications are, that China's on a roll and the Americans are in decline. Americans are retreating, China's moving forward. Sometimes facts are actually important. I mean, perceptions are critical, but sometimes facts matter. And all the changes that I summarized at the beginning in the international order over the last decades, that includes China's rise, have changed the position of the United States economically. In 1979, when this started, the U.S. represented about 26% of the world economy. All these years later, China's rise, all the dramatic, we've plunged. We're all the way down to 24.5% of the world economy. But if you control for population, we've gone from 6 to 4.5% of the world economy. So on a per capita basis, the U.S. has a bigger role than it did before China's rise began. The looking at a single data point to project. As a big economy, it can do things, and failing to note things like population change. Over the decades of China's rise, the workforce in China has increased by the minuscule amount of 350 million people. More than the total population of the United States have been added to the workforce. Each one doesn't have to do very much to produce a big increment in GDP growth, which is the aggregate of the productive capacity of the population. That's going to change, because population growth in China is over. The demographic dividend is over. Come back to that if you have questions. Having delayed military modernization in order to facilitate more rapid economic growth, to take advantage of what was perceived to be a limited window of opportunity, China reached a point that it judged it was both possible and necessary to put more money into military. Now, 2.5 decades ago. 2.5 decades of double-digit growth every year in the military, from a small base, So the aggregate growth takes a long time to really begin to have an impact. The perception of why it was necessary was what I characterize as a mirror imaging view of the United States. Chinese, generalizing outrageously, can't believe that the United States won't eventually pull the rug out from under the development strategy. All of the references to efforts to contain China, to surround China, to bolster its alliances in order to overthrow the government that one hears or reads regularly in China, that as China gets stronger, as China's economy gets bigger, they can't understand why the Americans haven't acted already to thwart it. So you better take advantage of that window of opportunity to bolster the deterrent capability, bolster an offensive capability, so if there is any problem, to push it further from China's shore. That's led to a significant buildup of military capacity, which, as I'll say in a few minutes, changed the strategic situation in Asia. China won't admit that it's changed it, but over the last decade, the aggregate growth in the military cap is 270%. The neighboring countries notice that. China rails against Japanese remilitarization. For 10 of the last 11 years, the Japanese defense budget, in response to China's buildup, has gone down. It turned around this year, it went up 0.8%. So the response is not arms race. The response is counterbalancing, looking to the United States as a counterbalance to China. It's part of a hedging strategy. China hedges, countries in the region hedge, the United States hedges. Hedging against not what they think is going to happen, but what's the worst that could happen if things go wrong. And there's a danger always that the hedging behaviors turn into self-fulfilling prophecies. An element of this that applies to China is, now that it has greater military capacity, now that its economy is so big, it is, some would say quite naturally, using this enhanced capacity, using its economic power as an instrument of pressure, cutting off exports of rare earth elements to Japan in response to an incident at sea, curtailing Chinese tourism to the Philippines in response to a territorial dispute over a reef. Sending of military forces on longer deployments into disputed territories. I'll come back to the why in a minute, but it's happening. And it changes perceptions. And China has been described now for about 5 years as having become more assertive. And for some, assertive morphs into aggressive in pursuit of its interest in the system, more dissatisfied with the US-led order, more dissatisfied with the alliance structures that are a part of that order, and so forth. I think this characterization is wrong. I think China has made some crucial, almost inexplicable foreign policy blunders over the last 5 years. But if you look at the total pattern of Chinese behavior, it's not more assertive. It's not more aggressive. It's louder on some things.